Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to present work from our project. We're very excited to be doing this presentation for you. I am Pawas Bisht. I am a senior lecturer in media at Kiel University. I'm also the deputy director for our Research Institute for Sustainable Futures. I am also the PI for the project. And this is the rest of the team. Eva is, of course, with us today to talk about the project. But very importantly, I mean, and these are really the key actors of our project. Dr. Sabina Kidwai, who is an associate professor at the AJK Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia Millia Islamia, and Dr. Sudeshna Devi, who is the research assistant on the project. This is a British Academy funded project on the Global Challenges Research Fund. And the way we're going to do this presentation is that Eva will set out some of the context and some of the kind of theoretical thinking, and then I'll pick up and take you through some emerging findings from the project. So I'll hand over to Eva.
Unmute myself. Oh yeah, I've just realized Pawas has got control of the slides. So so this I suppose we're going to talk first about why this project emerged and what the kind of response was. So one of the kind of key, I think, challenges that the project was responding to was the kind of air pollution crisis that is affecting India and affecting the city of Delhi in particular. I mean, the statistics here are really shocking, just on their own terms. Air pollution averages nearly 10 times the specified World Health Organization limit and is like the greatest threat to human health in India. Reduces life expectancy hugely. I mean, Pawas and I have kind of sat in on quite a number of kind of talks about this topic over the past few years. And some of the images that you see that kind of represent this are really shocking. You see people's lungs looking as though they've been kind of smoking for 40 years and they're kind of children's lungs or teenagers' lungs. So it's kind of reflected in a very kind of material sense in having impact in people's lives. And kind of related to this, potentially up to 30,000 people in Delhi lose their lives each year because of air pollution. And India itself is home to 21 out of 30 of the most polluted cities in the world. So life expectancy because of this could be increased dramatically if there were sort of mitigations and changes put in place to improve air quality. And one of the challenges, though, that we're seeing, and Pawas will talk about this in more depth shortly, is that the way this crisis is sometimes reported maybe is quite difficult, I think, to communicate this in a way that's engaging, despite the fact that these statistics are really kind of striking. We get a lot of these types of sort of visualizations, we get a lot of kind of statistics, a lot of quite kind of, I suppose, technical jargon used in science communication about the problem. And I think that's epitomized here by the caption on this type of image, when it talks about particulate matter, when it talks about the kind of the increase of that above the World Health Organization standards. It's sometimes really difficult to sort of ground and understand what some of these statistics mean in practice. And this is a pity because newspaper discourse, media discourse tends to kind of hinge on much of these kind of on this type of statistical information, accompanied by the odd kind of graphic that looks dramatic, but maybe doesn't kind of capture what it means on the ground or sort of mobilize action in a meaningful way. If you could move to the next slide, please. Now, the kind of inspiration really for the project emerged in the wake of the pandemic, when there was a lockdown, obviously, not just in India, but kind of lockdowns around the world. And suddenly at this point, you saw the rise of very different types of depictions of air pollution, which I know kind of Pawas was kind of really the inspiration for you kind of thinking around this as a kind of research project. I think you might want to speak a little bit to these images.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, I mean, you know, we were in lockdown and Eva and I were having some conversations about just communication that we were seeing on our social media feeds. I particularly, because a lot of my friends, colleagues, I grew up in the city of New Delhi, so I was seeing all of this kind of response filtering through this kind of vernacular rediscovery of a connection to nature. So there were stories about sort of people discovering peacocks, landing on the roofs and roosting there again. And there was really a kind of a very affective, deeply emotional rediscovery of this kind of non-human nature that was in the city. And with this, you could also see then that there was this hope being expressed, and this was not just us feeling this, but also advocacy organizations working in this area. So Center for Science and Environment took out a publication reflecting upon what happened during this lockdown period when the skies cleared up, and it has this very touching hope expressed in it, that could we hold on to this moment of rediscovery of this connection. So really, our project emerged from this, from a desire to examine what happens to this possibility. So I'll hand back to Eva.
If we could move on to the next slide, we kind of talk a little bit about how we started to make sense of this kind of phenomenon. So we weren't the only people who saw the potential, albeit very ambivalent potentials in these sorts of memes. So a number of people kind of were drawing on frameworks by Nicole Seymour on kind of bad environmentalism and kind of camp, silly kind of humour that's sometimes used in popular environmentalism as a kind of, as Pawas said really nicely, I think, vernacular way of kind of thinking about these problems that maybe move beyond more data-centric approaches and the kind of norms of science communication, and also move beyond kind of the affective logics of shame and fear that are sometimes associated with kind of environmental discourse on this topic by NGOs. And Bosworth, for instance, describes this as the kind of bad environmentalism of nature as healing memes. It's kind of offering another language, a slightly different language with slightly different affective kind of ways of framing things. But as kind of noted here, it's important to sort of remember that for all these potentials, this type of communication is still very, very ambivalent. So next slide, please. So far more kind of critical narratives have also been kind of put forward about these types of nature as healing memes. And some of these were from Delhi again, some of these were kind of fabricated images that people were sharing as a joke. Got the kind of London goats, etc. But all of these were kind of memes that were sort of circulating, joke or not, during lockdown. And Adam Searle and Jonathan Turnbull kind of talked about these potentials, but were slightly more wary in their approach, saying that yes, they kind of reveal an interesting logic, an interesting vernacular, but they're also dangerous. They're kind of highly ambivalent in this way. So this idea that nature will somehow resurge in the immediate absence of humans, they argue, propagates the dangerous idea that centuries of anthropogenic environmental abuse can be automatically remediated someday. And this kind of assumption, the celebration of these images, can maybe accommodate the slow violence of business as usual. So if we move to the next slide. So these kind of debates, I think, were kind of brought to a head when, exactly as sort of Searle and Turnbull predicted, the kind of events in Delhi proved to be a very sort of short fix. And only a year later, you had not just business as usual with the return of smog, with the return of pollution, but such an intense period of air pollution that a temporary lockdown had to be imposed solely to deal with the problem of air pollution. So to put it slightly differently, whereas in 2020, there was a kind of lockdown to deal with COVID, a lockdown 12 months later had to be imposed to just solely deal with the problem of air pollution. And this is clearly kind of not a quick fix, and it was very kind of sort of economically and socially kind of damaging. So if you move to the next slide, please. So to kind of crystallize some of these debates, on one hand, memes offer this new vernacular, they disrupted all normative effective logics, but this kind of approach also foregrounded obvious limitations of more light-hearted approaches to dealing with air pollution. And some of these debates, we feel, crystallized many of the core debates about environmental storytelling and what it can do, and I suppose work academically that needs to be done in order to interrogate it. So if we move to the next slide. So a huge amount of work has emerged in recent years about the importance of stories in relation to environmental politics. So these kind of ideas have been put forward by kind of key thinkers in fields like extinction studies, for example. And it was kind of Tom Van Doren who kind of coined this idea of an ethics of storytelling and really kind of advocated sort of telling stories about non-human animals on the kind of dull edge of extinction, as he puts it. He kind of argued that new forms of kind of care and new forms of affective responsibility can be generated through academics kind of centralizing the stories of other species. And these ideas were kind of taken up still further by Donna Haraway, if we kind of move forward again. But these debates tended to be argued, or tended to focus on academic stories. You know, what stories can theorists tell about non-human animals, about extinction, about pollution? And one of the things that Pawas and I kind of talk about quite a lot is, well, stories are happening all the time in much more popular contexts than in academic sort of monographs such as these. What stories are already being told about issues like extinction, issues like air pollution? And how do we make sense of those stories? Are some stories more effective than others? How do we kind of think about the ethics in a slightly different way? What are the ethics of storytelling in practice? So finally, next slide. And to kind of sort of address these types of questions, I think, Pawas, you were finding that some of the kind of important work being done by Indigenous kind of scholars reflecting on the ethics and politics of storytelling have been particularly useful. So I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Eva. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I found Robin Wall Kimmerer's work really inspirational in this regard, as somebody who not only reminds us of the power of storying in the process of restoration, but also crucially is asking us this question about which sets of knowledge, which stories are we going to recover. So Angie herself, straddles these different domains as a botanist, but also as a creative writer and an Indigenous scholar. She is really able to bring these different knowledge systems together and really disrupt established hierarchies of value in relation to nature. So I have found, her thinking and writing really, really helpful. And this core question of which values, knowledge systems and stories are we privileging was a key conceptual question for us as we worked on the design of the project. So just to very quickly recapture some of the key themes that were kind of animating our project was this desire to move beyond this information deficit model of environmental communication, to bring to the active storytelling, engaging affect, emotion. So bringing storytelling and science communication together and to try and do this in practice. But what kinds of stories? So really keeping in view the need for an ethics of storytelling, centrally trying to highlight absences and inequalities in existing media storytelling around air pollution, and thinking about ways of addressing some of these absences. We were also very aware of the fact that a lot of the narratives that were in circulation only formulated relationships of harm and damage whenever they were formulating human nature relationships, and this desire and need for really for hopeful environmental narratives which could foreground existing presence, which demonstrated relationships of reciprocal care, were needed. We were aware of this need, and again, we've tried to sort of do this in the kind of more applied parts of the project. So it's a 2-year project. We had a bit of delay because of lockdown, and that affected our ability to also get this project going on ground. So the project at the moment runs until November 2023. It's, as I said, funded by the British Academy under the Humanities and Social Sciences Tackling Global Challenges program. And these are the 3 strands that we have to the project. The first strand is about analyzing media narratives around air pollution in the news media. So wanting to pin down how is the story being told in and by mass media. And we're looking at a time period that extends. It's a 3-year time period. We're looking at the storytelling before the period of the lockdown. Then we're looking at the lockdown period, and we're carrying on to a year after the lockdown to really trace the possibility of any kind of change. The second aspect is we are looking at the sort of key stakeholders who are working in the field of air pollution advocacy, some very fine organizations doing research and advocacy work in the city and nationally. So we are looking at their storytelling and how they're employing storytelling in their advocacy work. And finally, there's this creative and applied dimension to the project where we are commissioning and working with 3 sets of filmmakers to develop 3 new film narratives, which we are hoping are more effective, ethical, and empowering, and addressing some of the gaps that we are seeing through our media research. So these are some very early trends that we are seeing in the media storytelling. The slides today are capturing some of the broad trends, and hopefully in the question and answer part of today's sessions, we might get into some of the complexities of these trends, and hopefully we'll have time to explore that. Generally, what we are observing, before I get into that, just very quickly, for those of you who are interested, we're looking at four newspapers, 2 Hindi, 2 English language. We're looking at the ones with the biggest circulations. We're looking at 2 TV channels again, 1 English language, 1 Hindi language. And like I said, we're looking at a 3-year period, sort of keeping the lockdown period in the center, and 1 year back and 1 year forward. So what are we finding? What we broadly see is that there's a failure to narrativize air pollution as a fundamental and persistent problem. So the coverage of air pollution is very, very episodic, and it would be comical if it's not, if it were not so really tragic. That what we see within the media is that the coverage around air pollution really only begins in what is actually labeled as the air pollution season, which are the winter months, when the pollution becomes really a catastrophic visible crisis. So air pollution is an issue throughout the year. So Eva highlighted on the original slide, we have levels that are 10 times, and those levels are high throughout the year, but the media attention is concentrated in this period of a visible catastrophic crisis. And this episodic nature also then means that there is very little thematic or sustained narrativizing of the causes, consequences, responsibilities. What we are seeing, this alignment with a certain kind of calendar of air pollution or a season of air pollution, we are often seeing meteorological causes being put as a key frame for air pollution, and which you can see is very, very problematic in terms of clearly removing any kind of human agency in this. This graph that you're seeing on the right is actually showing you the complexity of the air pollution problem with a variety of different contributors, vehicular pollution being a very, very key contributor, waste burning, construction industry, household pollution. So you can see that there's a kind of a complex mix of different factors. What we see in the storytelling, however, is that there is a tendency in the media storytelling to locate the problem outside the domains of the city. While we can clearly see even in this graph that, you know, vehicular pollution and industry construction, all of which is kind of tied into central economic interests of the city dwellers, are key contributors of air pollution. The media coverage has an inordinate focus upon non-local sources of air pollution. I mean, what is interesting perhaps also to look at that graph is how they, at the top, do create this separation between Delhi's local sources, NCR towns, and so you can see there, NCR is National Capital Region. Now, Delhi is a city of 20 million, and the National Capital Region is basically referring to suburbs that are actually continuous with the city. So there's really no meaningful separation between Delhi and the National Capital Region. But for media storytelling, we see this, that the salience of this desire to create a category of the non-local that can then be blamed for generating air pollution. A key category of the non-local are farmers who are practicing intensive agriculture in the states of Punjab and Haryana. These are bordering states, and they burn some of their crop residue. So they're burning the rice to plant the wheat crop. And because they have such a short gap between the rice crop and the wheat crop, that the only pathway they have to achieve these two crops is to burn the residue. And this burning of this residue creates an added pressure in the winter months, and the media coverage tends to focus a lot of its attention upon this non-local source, which actually, if you look at the overall contribution, is quite a small part of the contribution to air pollution and the larger narrative around air pollution. So it goes back again to this idea of visibility and the media needing a simple narrative, a simple focus, also a visual focus for pinning down some of this responsibility. There is a linked tendency that we are seeing of a highlighting of privatized solutions. When we are looking at some of the actual physical copies of newspapers, when we are doing our sampling and coding, what is remarkable is that almost all coverage of air pollution is accompanied by full-page spreads of advertising spreads of selling personalized air purification solutions. So you can see here there's an ad for an air purifier, and this goes right along a story of air pollution. So you can see that the addressal is to a kind of a very narrow metropolitan middle-class affluent audience, and an absence very clearly of a recognition of the inequalities that are in play within the urban environment. And here's an example of a worker who is hugely exposed to this air pollution and does not have the possibility of retreating into a private space. In a linked move, what we are seeing is that there is also a lot of focus and space given to state actors in the media storytelling. And there is a clear mobilization by the state actors also of this kind of visible interventions, monumental visible interventions. So we've had very recently the city government constructing 4 or 5 of these smog towers that have been built in very prominent parts of the city. And you can see this is a huge installation. And for scale, you can see some people standing next to it. And this is right in the middle of the city. So this almost this kind of monument to air pollution, which in scientific studies has already been proven to be completely ineffective as a solution to kind of tackle the problem at scale. So this has a very, very limited spatial impact on reducing air pollution. But it is very effective as a symbolic intervention, and we having our students in our partner institution in Jamia have done some sociological work around it, collecting narratives of people's responses to these kind of interventions. And we see that there is actually a very positive reception. People feel something is being done, about them. They feel kind of addressed. And here is another example of these, mist sprays that are being used in the city and really mobilized. And again, I like that. You can see the kind of almost the militaristic dimension of how that is a cannon that is shooting mist into the air. And this, of course, the metaphor of a battle against air pollution is used all the time. So I think there's some kind of neat alignment of those interventions, that kind of broader narrative of a battle being waged against air pollution. So very broadly, what are we seeing in terms of silences? We're seeing an absence of voices and perspectives of those that are the most vulnerable. So we don't, in the narrative, we never get a sense of a diffused or differentiated vulnerabilities or differentiated responsibilities. So we don't get to hear from the urban poor. Very little space is afforded to the people who are being blamed, the non-local farmers, workers, citizens. They're kind of really absent from the storytelling. There is also really little attention being paid to the systemic changes that are needed to address this crisis. So we really don't see in the media storytelling narratives around the need for transforming, transport, mobility, energy, food production. And even where we see perhaps a mention of this, we are not seeing in the storytelling the creation of an imagination of alternative futures. So we really, that desire for a hopeful, livable future is somehow not being envisioned in the media storytelling. A larger point, and I think this is quite a troubling absence and really needs addressing, is that air pollution is not being linked to the larger issue of the need to tackle climate change. And while we are concentrating on media from within the city, you would have seen from that first graph that Eva shared and spoke about, where we're seeing how air pollution is a huge problem across India and across the whole of the North Indian belt. Conditions are exactly the same. There are cities actually that have worse air pollution than New Delhi. But what we don't see is that kind of breadth of connection making and thinking in the media storytelling. In fact, as I've highlighted, the kind of saliency of demarcating the city's population as being the victims is actually quite a troubling tendency that we're seeing. Okay, so a lot of sort of problems highlighted in what we're seeing within existing narratives, but we're trying, there's an applied dimension where we're trying to sort of also intervene in this and not simply say what's wrong. We are working on sharing some of these findings and discussing these and sharing these with our partners within the civil society, advocacy, and scientific research community. So we will be holding an event later in the summer where we will be bringing together some of these stakeholders and really looking at all of these research findings together and making sense of them. A key strand of what we are doing is as I said, we're developing new films, and we have commissioned 3 films, and I will show you some details of these on the next slide. We are also directly attempting to train a new generation of environmental communicators in India. We're very lucky that our partners in New Delhi, the Kidwai Mass Communication Research Center, is a premier leading center for training journalists and filmmakers. And we have, as part of the project, developed a course on environmental storytelling, specifically focusing on air pollution, that we've been delivering now for 2 years with 2 different cohorts there. So the films I mentioned, these are the films, the 3 films that we have commissioned, each attempting to address a gap that we have noticed in our own research. So Delhi 2.5, a film this has been made, we are ready with the rough cut, has been made by Amit Bose and Siddharth Subramaniam, focuses on the health impacts of air pollution, looking particularly at the impact of air pollution on children's health. So Delhi 2.5 is a reference to the particulate PM 2.5, a particulate matter that is often used in communicating about air pollution. But Delhi 2.5 is they're labeling a generation that is growing up with the impacts of air pollution. The film has, we've already been told that the film will be shown at the British Academy's summer showcase. So if there's interest within this group to watch the film, we will be happy to share the screening details. So this will happen in June. City Moves is a film that focuses on mobility within the city. I highlighted that personal vehicular transport is a key source of pollution, but is often actually underplayed in the media storytelling. And this film is looking at the experiences of people within the city who use bicycles and are pedestrians, and what is their experience of actually performing the alternative that the city needs, and the kind of challenges that they're experiencing in performing that alternative as part of their kind of everyday life. Again, narratives that are completely absent. So this film is doing that. And finally, we have a film which looks at stubble burning, this issue of the farmers who are blamed for contributing to the city's catastrophe during the winter months. But what we are doing with this film, working with Charles Sayed, who's the filmmaker, is to contextualize this narrative within a larger narrative of a failed green revolution. I'm sure that some of you would be aware of a lot of recent work emerging around the failures of industrial food production and these green revolution technologies that were in the 60s and the 70s exported to a lot of the developing world. So we are contextualizing what is happening, the kind of impossible situation that the farmers are being put in, and giving voice to the farmers, and also to some farmers that are attempting to try something different and practice a different kind of agriculture. So really linking the air pollution crisis also to larger crisis in terms of both climate change, but also the need for a transition that has to involve systemic changes. Eva, do you want to say anything about the films? This is really the last part of the presentation.
Yeah. all I wanted to say really was just give a bit of context on how these filmmakers were selected and things. So we had a kind of 2-day workshop that I wasn't able to attend because I had some visa issues. But anyway, Pawas, Sudeshna and Sabina spent kind of 2 days really with advocacy groups, and the filmmakers kind of spoke to and engaged with those kind of advocates to sort of think about different facets of air pollution. And I think it was it sort of 15 young groups of filmmakers who kind of attended that kind of short course. And these were then these ideas that they kind of pitched in the wake of doing that training, and in the wake of kind of their own reflections about whose stories were missing. And I think what was really inspiring for me, kind of hearing the kind of ideas and the narratives put forward by all of the filmmakers, was the kind of care at which they thought about these issues. Many of them kind of wanted to represent issues from their communities and that they were facing, as well as trying to kind of uncover these sort of other stories to sort of address some of the things that are missing. The other thing I kind of wanted to flag up really was, as well as sort of thinking about this in terms of maybe an alternative form of science communication, a kind of a different form of storytelling, is maybe how this speaks back in particular ways to some of these debates that have been happening in theoretical contexts about the value of storytelling. So as I noted at the beginning, kind of this idea of the ethics of storytelling had emerged in these quite specific, I suppose, academic contexts. And a lot of claims were being made about it, but they were sort of, I suppose, claims that existed in these sort of theoretical domains. And what we were sort of hoping to do was think about some of the ways in which popular storytelling and filmmaking in practice might speak back to and kind of complicate some of the assumptions that were unfolding in contexts like the environmental humanities about kind of how stories might work and be engaged with. There are calls at the moment for a kind of empirical environmental humanities that sort of engages more with audience research to understand how people receive and engage with stories rather than just assuming that stories work and stories are effective. But what I suppose we were hoping to do was go beyond that a little bit to really think about how stories are made on a very practical level, because, you know, popular storytelling is everywhere for better or for worse and with ambivalent consequences sometimes, as the example of the memes showed. And we kind of felt that that type of sort of those types of practicalities really needed to be interrogated, but that wasn't only sort of empirically significant perhaps, but could, as I said, sort of speak back to some of those academic debates in interesting ways. So yeah, that's all I was going to say about that really, but thank you.